This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you about the state's people, places, and culture. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. It was 114 years ago this month that one of history's most famous shipwrecks happened, caused by a collision with an iceberg in the dark. The Titanic, the luxury ship once deemed unsinkable, was rent asunder. It went down in the Atlantic Ocean, and it was on its way from Southampton, England, to New York City. You might be thinking, okay, but what does this have to do with Minnesota? Well, we received a question from an anonymous listener who wanted to know, were there any Minnesotans on board the Titanic the night that it sunk? I asked reporter Christa Lawler to look into this one for us. Christa reports from Duluth and is our resident shipwrecks expert at the Minnesota Star Tribune. Thanks for being here, Christa.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so I'm guessing many of our listeners have seen the epic movie Titanic with Leo and Kate, but if you could give us a refresher, tell us about what happened that night.
Okay, well, first of all, I should say that I have not seen the movie in its entirety, and I might be the
What?
only person in the entire universe
No
who
way!
hasn't.
No way!
No, I haven't. I saw part of it, and I ended up leaving the theater midway through for, I don't even remember why. Not because it was bad, but just because it was long.
I'm the king of the
You saw the I'm King of the World, though, right? Did you make it to that part?
I made it to the King of the World, and it was getting long, and I ended up walking out of the theater, not because I didn't like it, but
You had places to be.
I was a busy girl.
Wow, so one of the rare Minnesotans who hasn't seen the movie, but that just doesn't matter today.
For sure. I've read a lot about this, and of course, I love shipwrecks, so
Yes, yeah, you know the story. So tell us all about April 14th, 1912.
on that night, it was in the dark of night when the ship hit an iceberg. And it was a bump that people on board did feel. It woke some people up. Some people chose to ignore it and stay in, but others maybe sent their husband or went out themselves to kind of look around and find out what was happening. Some, of course, didn't realize the severity of what was going on. And of course, in the uncertainty of all of it, not everyone wanted to hop into a lifeboat. You can imagine that it was a terrifying situation. It's dark, the water is churning, people are trying to get you to go overboard onto a smaller ship. You'd almost want to stay in the safety of the Titanic, despite the fact that it's going down.
Wow.
And it would take 3 hours for it to go down. And during that time, some of the first class passengers maybe had an easier way of getting off the ship, but they eventually did get a bunch of people off and onto lifeboats and onto a rescue boat.
And how many total people were on board, and then how many of them survived?
So after it left port, it did make a few stops and ended up with 2,200 people on board. About 1,500 died, so roughly 700 lived.
Wow. Wow. So the question that you looked into was about the Minnesotans on board. And what did you learn? How many people were there?
So there were 35 people with a connection to Minnesota on board the ship, some who lived and some who did not. And some we don't know. We don't know what happened to them, especially one mysterious guy that I'll get into later.
Oh, that's intriguing. Okay, so where did you go to find this answer?
Well, old newspaper archives, of course. It's my favorite resource. There's a really good article from the Minnesota Historical Society that actually looks into the people from Minnesota who were aboard the ship. And it's really well done. It's really comprehensive. That was helpful. There's also a list of people who were on board, and it's not 100% complete, but it's a good reference point also.
Is that like a ship manifest that then like showed where everybody was going?
There's a database of passengers who were aboard. It's kind of almost like an encyclopedia. So it'll have the names of people, where they were headed, how old they were, what country they came from, what state, parents. It has a lot of information, addresses. It's pretty comprehensive, although it doesn't have everyone, of course.
That's so interesting. And I'm curious about who the people connected to Minnesota were. Were they all wealthy, folks who could afford a first-class ticket, or more working class, or people immigrating here?
Well, all of those different groups of people were on board the Titanic. Most of them who are tied to this area, or at least the ones we've heard of, seem to be first class passengers, except for that one guy that I keep dangling in front of you who is kind of mysterious. For the most part, the ones that we know about all were traveling first class.
Got it. Those were the folks who kind of told their stories to the press.
Right.
And also, in general, a larger percentage of first-class passengers survived overall.
Correct. Right.
Okay, so how many of those, you said 35 passengers, how many ended up surviving?
So of the 35 with ties to this area, about 16 that we know of survived.
So you found in the newspaper archives some of these survivors' stories. What are some of the ones that they told reporters once they returned? Can you start us off with one?
For sure. One of the most famous would be John Pillsbury Schneider and his wife Nellie, who were on their honeymoon or on their way back from Europe from their honeymoon when they hit the iceberg. He came from a famous family. Obviously, you think flour mill family. Her father was a merchant. They were first-class passengers. They made it aboard a rescue vessel and ended up back in New York City, where they kind of holed up at the Waldorf for a while to kind of recover from what they had been through. But both of them went on to lead pretty normal lives. He worked in business until he was in his 70s, and he died golfing. She lived to be 94 years old. She has a kind of cute story.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the Star Tribune, a reporter talked to her granddaughter about a decade after she died and asked what the fate of the ship should be. Should they raise it, kind of mine through it and see what's in there, or just leave it to rest? That's often a question with shipwrecks. It's like, do you want to disturb the final resting place of these people, or do you want to go down and kind of hunt through what remains? And what she had told her daughter is, no, I think it should be left alone as an international burial ground. But boy, I sure would like to find my trunk. And if you think about it, coming back from a honeymoon, what kind of gifts and purchases might be in that?
Yeah.
Now at the bottom of the Atlantic.
I know. I'm also imagining, think of how many times she was asked what it was like and how many times she told those stories over and over through her long life.
For sure. They did talk about it. There are some people who were aboard the Titanic with Minnesota connections who kind of went quiet after it happened and didn't want to talk about it anymore.
That is understandable. Well, I know you have more stories from Minnesotans who were on the Titanic that night, and we'll get into more of them after the break. Curious Minnesota is going live this spring. We will be recording live at the Strib Outdoor Adventure for All event on Saturday, May 9th at the Trailhead at Theodore Wirth Park. It's a celebration of Minnesota's abundant natural resources and recreation opportunities. Send us your best questions about Minnesota's outdoors, and we might feature your question at the event. Send them to curious@startribune.com. Thanks. We're back, but before we continue our conversation, I wanted to tell you that this podcast is produced by Melissa Townsend and the music is by Matt Gilmer. Okay, so I understand there was also a Duluthian on board who told reporters that a fortune teller had predicted she would die on a trip to Europe, but in a twist, she survived. So tell me about this woman from Duluth.
Right. This one is my favorite. Her name is Constance Willard. She was 21 years old, first-class passenger, and she did make it off the boat. She was one of those people kind of hanging back, not really willing to hop into a lifeboat, but she did. And it was only later that she remembered that at one point a fortune teller had told her that she would die when she was 21 years old on a trip to Europe. So a very similar scenario, but she did survive. In interviews right afterward, she recalled the horrors of it. There was a quote from her in this story. "The ship was lighted until it disappeared under the waves. Shortly after it sank, the cries of those in the water rang through the air. Then all was still for a few seconds, and again the cries only fainter." I think that's so haunting to imagine yourself in that scenario.
Yeah, and was she traveling by herself?
She was by herself, yes. And Constance is one of those people who went on to say, I'm not talking about this anymore. She ended up moving to California and not talking about it again.
Wow, that's amazing. So I also wanted to ask you about a Twin Cities couple who are on board, the Douglases. Can you talk about them?
For sure. Walter D. Douglas, his father was the founder of Quaker Oats Company, was traveling with his wife Mahala and their maid, and they were aboard the ship. They were going to Europe to find furnishings. They had just built a new house in Lake Minnetonka, a new mansion. Mahala got on a lifeboat and tried to get her husband to come aboard with her. And he said, no, you go on ahead. I'll catch up with you later. He did not think that it was gentlemanly to get on when there were still women and children aboard the Titanic who hadn't yet gotten onto lifeboats. He said, I would not be a man or gentleman if I left the Titanic while there was a woman or child on board. It's all right. I'll probably be with you again in a few minutes. But of course, he did not end up making it onto a lifeboat. So when she got back, she was kind of taken into her Minnetonka home, a place called Walden. She never remarried. She ended up dying in 1945. But in the interim between then, she did end up traveling more, even aboard ships. So it didn't scare her off of travel.
Wow. Now, let's get to the man whose story you've been dangling in front of us all episode. I know you also learned about a con man with a Minnesota connection who was on board. What's his story?
Okay, so thank you for asking. Harry Silverberg, maybe that was his name. He had dozens of aliases, and he was once referred to as the world's greatest crook. And it's assumed that he had gone aboard the Titanic to try to bilk people in card games, knowing there were a lot of wealthy people on board. So he was kind of a mysterious character. He lived in Minneapolis, and he had married two different women. One was the stepdaughter of a millionaire. He also ran a school of hypnosis. So he was kind of a slippery character. While he was on board the Titanic, I think he was masquerading as an Astor. And as fans of the movie and those who've read a lot about it know, there was an Astor aboard who ended up going down with the ship.
So why would he have pretended to be an Astor exactly?
Well, the Astors were a well-known, wealthy East Coast family with great name recognition.
Gotcha.
But it's unclear whether he made it off the ship or whether he went down, but it's assumed that he died. So who knows if he found his way aboard a lifeboat and started a new life with one of those dozens of aliases. But he's kind of a slippery character of some renown who was on board.
Wow, what a life. That is so interesting. And did you learn anything else as you delved into this question? Did anything surprise you?
I guess I had just never considered that there would be Minnesotans on board. I mean, you kind of think of East Coast and a great wealth, but I suppose during this period there was great wealth also in Minnesota. In fact, the Pillsburys went on to become involved in mining, which obviously was huge in that period in this area. So I guess it makes sense, but it never occurred to me that even someone from Duluth would be on board the Titanic.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you so much, Christa. This has been great.
Yeah, super fun.
And thanks to our listener who was curious about the Minnesotans on board the Titanic. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at StarTribune.com. And if you have feedback or a question that you'd like us to answer, send a note to curious@StarTribune.com. Until next time, stay curious.